Bob Herbert's OpEd.tv is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation with the support of Ann Ulnick. Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. The last time we had Brent Staples on, I said that he was one of the best thinkers and writers at the New York Times. Since then, he has won the Pulitzer Prize for editorial writing. I rest my case. It is a pleasure to congratulate and welcome back my former colleague, Brent Staples of the New York Times. Mr. Brent, welcome.
You, Bob. Thank you for inviting me.
And congratulations. I mean, that is really just a well-deserved triumph. Oh. And we'll talk a little bit later about your career, your sterling career in journalism. But first, you know, one of the topics that led to the Pulitzer, one of the issues that you've editorialized about was the racism that ran like a virus through the women's suffrage movement. And in fact, New York City is now planning to put up a monument in Central Park to Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And ordinarily, that's the kind of thing that you'd say is a good thing. I mean, you would celebrate it. But you have some problems with that. Mm-hmm. So talk to us about it.
Well, the women's suffrage movement itself was, as the historian Nell Irvin Painter has said, because you're a feminist doesn't excuse you for subscribing to white supremacy. Mm-hmm. The women's suffrage movement in the period after the Civil War became caught up in a debate about whether the movement would support the 15th Amendment,
right,
which ostensibly gave black men the right to vote.
It was supposed to give them the right to vote, right.
And you know, the chief organization run by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and to some extent Susan B. Anthony refused to support it. The movement split over that point. They basically, the majority of the people left that movement to start a rival organization that supported the 15th Amendment. In her criticism of the 15th Amendment, Stanton made an openly racist appeal. She summoned up images that were being used by Klansmen in the South to substantiate lynching. She talked about the tyranny of uneducated black men and basically termed them incipient rapists, and talked about, you know, referred to them as Sambos and so on, and that, you know, white women were more worthy of the vote than these uneducated Sambos. On the other side of that were black suffragists like Frances Harper, who was at that very meeting in 1866 in Manhattan, where the main organization was founded. Mm-hmm. And she was, Harper was what I would call a radical egalitarian. And she basically stood up at that meeting and she told all the white women, she basically said, well, you women talk of rights, I talk of wrongs. She says, what do you think about the fact that I'm being thrown off of streetcars? Mm-hmm. Not because I'm a woman, but because I'm black. So the contretemps between these two sides were really about Anthony and Stanton in particular, trying to separate gender from race. And people like Frances Harper saying, you simply can't do that.
You cannot do it.
And she was saying to them that to be credible, to be just, the women's rights movement has to take on racism as an issue. And that's at the very beginning. It's in 1866
right,
where they're talking about this. And, you know, Frances Harper, the speech she gave was just so modern in its appeal.
Well, when you use the term radical egalitarianism, what ran through my head is, boy, we could use a lot more of that right now.
Yes, yes. And so I think that initially, a lot of historians in the 70s were worshipful of Stanton and glossed over this racism issue. Over the last 20 years, however, she's been taken to task in many, many books, and it's now genuinely acknowledged that she was a classist and a classic liberal racist, and that needs to be reckoned with. And so, bringing to your question, to put a suffrage memorial, the first suffrage memorial in Central Park, in the most polyglot city in America, that consists of just those two white women, is unacceptable. It's unacceptable. Because also, after Stanton using this racist appeal, she also seized control of suffrage history.
Right.
In this multi-volume book that still dominates the history. It's called History of Women's Suffrage. And essentially wrote black women out of that.
Most people who grew up, especially in the years when you and I grew up, that's what you learned about women's suffrage. Whether it came directly from those volumes or not, it came indirectly from those volumes.
Yeah, it did, for them. Yeah. So basically what I said in the last column, I read about this on the editorial page, that if you put in a memorial that consists of these women represented indisputably a racist, classist faction of the women's rights movement.
Right. And so they should not be the representatives.
No, that's right.
Of that movement.
Just to say, and for your viewers, if we were eliminating people from memorials who were racist,
right,
we wouldn't have any memorials.
That's true.
But I think it's our job now, in the era of the controversy over the Confederate memorials in the South, being taken down in places like New Orleans. In this period of time, it's important that we do the best we can to provide an accurate picture of the history we were memorializing.
Well, you've written a lot about the black women. They weren't just women, but the black women who were so important to the suffrage movement. Now, if you two who were major historical figures were Ida B. Wells and Sojourner Truth. So let's just talk a little bit now. It's really weird. A lot of young people don't know who they were. But anyway, talk a little bit about their contribution.
Well, Sojourner Truth was born a slave in Ulster County, I believe it was New York.
Yep, upstate.
And she came out of slavery. She's pursued recourse through the courts, I think, to get the freedom of her children, and became a traveling speaker for abolition and for women's rights. It's one of the genuinely heroic figures of the 19th century. Ida B. Wells comes along later in the 19th century and becomes a campaigning newspaper woman in Memphis, Tennessee, where she begins to write about lynching in the 1890s and is essentially run out of Memphis for writing a scalding editorial in which she accurately pointed out that black men were being lynched for the charge on the trumped-up charge of rape in cases where they were having consensual relationships with white women.
Right.
Now that was an explosive thing to say.
You're right.
In the South at the time,
she could easily cost you your life.
Yeah, she wasn't the only person, only newspaper person who said that. But she was run out. The paper was burned to the ground, and so she moves to the North and becomes a campaigning anti-lynching person who goes abroad. She writes her pamphlets, the Red Record, Southern Horrors. These things are really forensic accounts of lynching and the inhumanity they represented. When she eventually moved to Chicago, where she founds, I think, the first black suffrage organization in Illinois, and becomes a political figure. She becomes a political figure motivates black voters to elect the first black congressman since Reconstruction. So both these women are giants both of the civil rights movement and the suffrage movement. And I think that the issue is this. For middle-class white women in the suffrage movement, they would say that, well, us not having the vote is like us being slaves.
Right.
And the black woman would say, wait a minute,
Hold on.
It's not quite like that. And also, like Francis Harper would tell them, it's not quite like that.
Right.
Also, if white women got the vote tomorrow, it wouldn't solve our problem because, in fact, white women would split the same way white men do.
Right.
She said a third would vote with the status quo, a third would vote with their prejudices, and a third would vote somewhere else. So let's not talk about that as the panacea.
Right.
So for black women, the struggle for the vote was inextricably bound up with the struggle for civil and human and women's rights.
Now, you've also written about less well-known figures, black women, who were important to the suffrage movement. And two who I thought were really, their stories were really fascinating, were Sarah Smith Tompkins Garnett and Susan Maria McKinney Stewart, who were actually sisters. Tell us about them.
Well, those sisters, Sarah and her sister, were born in the Shinnecock Reservation, I think, in Long Island. Their father was a purveyor, I think, of pork, so they were affluent family. Their base of operations became Brooklyn. And Ms. Garnett was, like most affluent black women of her period, was intimately involved in community uplift and education. She started a night school for adults to teach them skills. She also started a suffrage organization that talked about the values and the necessity of giving women the right to vote. But here again, her appeal for the women's right to vote was bound up also with the question of civil rights. And her sister became the first black female physician in the state of New York.
Isn't that something? When I read that, it blew my mind.
Yeah. These women, and the issue, part of the problem here is that, going back again to Stanton and Anthony's history of women's suffrage, they minimized the presence of black women in that struggle, number one. And number two, white suffragists in the period of time tended not to record the remarks that black women made because they didn't fit the pat convenient narrative.
Right.
And so you have to go around and find them in obscure newspapers and sort of reconstruct their lives. But, Ms. Garnett and her sister, they traveled abroad. They were prominent figures across America because they also affiliated with the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. And through that, they pushed the suffrage and the twin suffrage and civil rights messages. Also, they came across Ida B. Wells in New York. When Ida B. Wells was run out of Memphis and spoke in New York City, they went to hear her speak. And they also, after that point, started yet another organization to support her anti-lynching work.
Wow.
So the history of colored women's clubs in America is beginning to be written about, but it's obscure to many people. And as we come forward in this, we're going to see that people like Garnett and her classes of people, Josephine Ruffin in Boston, and several others, Fannie Barrier Williams in Chicago, these women, and Mary Church Terrell in Washington, D.C., the argument can be made that, that black people only survived the transition from the Jim Crow South to the urban North because of the social uplift and work of these women. They started settlement houses for people. They did education. Fannie Barrier Williams in Chicago, she advocated for opening up the employment places to black women. She started her own stenography classes in her home because black women couldn't get into stenography.
Right.
She was instrumental in developing Providence Hospital, I think it's called Providence Hospital, in Chicago, an interracial hospital, right, that treated both black and white patients, which is a radical thing in the late 19th, early 20th century. And also, she shared the stage with Stanton. And she shared the stage with many white feminists, Fannie Barry Williams, and she never compromised on this point. She kept saying, I need you all to understand that the struggle of black women and black people generally to enter the workplace, to have respectable middle-class lives, the racism of white American women is the principal obstacle to that. So they basically, so you see there again, you have this conflict. She's talking about civil rights,
Yep.
and she's saying to white suffragists, you need to clean up the racism in your ranks and take on this issue.
Again, it's a message that resonates today.
Yes, it's a
When we
very
listen to
modern,
these words.
it's a very modern message.
Yeah. So given the kind of history you're talking about of the suffrage movement, why do you think a supposedly liberal city like New York has taken such a narrow view when it comes to putting up a monument to the movement?
Well, a couple things. I would say that, first of all, I will say to you, I am 99 and 9/10%, if not 100% confident that that monument will be revised. I'd go out on a limb this week and say, you will hear in a short period of time that that monument has been revised.
And what you mean by that is that it'll be more inclusive.
Yes.
Yeah.
Someone black will be represented there.
Right.
But you see, we often talk about victors writing the history, right? Stanton and Anthony seized control of the history in the 1880s, and they dictated the narrative. So people grew up with that narrative. And it was a narrative in which black women were missing.
Right.
Even then, they were a tremendous force beginning in the late 1800s, a tremendous force for social good and for activism. And so basically that monument was arrived at through the work of private philanthropy, and people were working within the limits of their knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And I think probably working within the limits of their knowledge and ignoring others who said, you can't do this.
Right. So they just barreled ahead.
Yeah.
And they made a mistake.
Yes.
So let's talk about your Pulitzer and a little bit about your career.
Mm-hmm.
How did you find out that you had won? Where were you?
I was at work, and the
In
editor.
the New York Times building.
I was working in the New York Times building in Manhattan, and the editor of the editorial page pulled me aside and said, "Listen."
Pull me aside.
He said, this is you've been overdue for this, and it's arrived.
Whoa.
And he was very, James Bennett. He was very kind and a very felicitous editor with whom to work, and he made it easier for me to do my work. I mean, he cleared a lot of obstacles that I had in the past. And so I was, I'm not, as you know, I'm not usually speechless, but
I've never seen you speechless.
but I was.
I was just going to ask you, how did you react? Right.
I was
right.
I sort of looked at him, and I was for some minutes, quite taken aback by that.
When and how did you tell your wife?
Oh, I called her on the phone.
Right away?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I called her on the phone, and she was on a business trip, and she wasn't surprised at all.
Right. Very interesting.
She wasn't surprised at all. She
Very
said, she said, I knew you had a really strong entry and you were doing great work, so I thought that the possibility was very good.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
So how did you get into this racket? You had options. When and how did you get into newspapers?
I was in the 1970s a PhD student at the University of Chicago, and I was working on a doctorate in psychology, and I began to write for free weekly newspapers, small newspaper called Chicago Journal, no longer extant, and a bigger one called the Chicago Reader, which is quite famous in its day and is still published. And I would write my academic work in the morning, and I'd write like these magazine-length stories in the afternoon.
Two different styles.
Yes, and basically the afternoons got to be more fun.
Right.
I taught some, and I applied for some teaching jobs at august institutions. And I found, among other things, that, a young black guy in his early 30s, single black guy, on a lot of college campuses at that point was, regardless of his qualifications, was seen as kind of threat.
Right.
He's kind of a loose cannon. And I went to give a talk, like an interview talk at one famous small private college whose name shall remain anonymous. And it occurred to me halfway through the talk that the people there, they weren't really looking for a colleague. They were sizing up who a bridge partner might be.
Wow.
Wow. And so I saw that. And also I worked as there's a lot of news now about how poorly paid adjunct professors are.
Mm-hmm.
I worked briefly as an adjunct at a large Midwestern school, and the pay was so abysmal. And I thought to myself that this is a form of bondage. And as I later wrote of it, people don't quit adjunct jobs, they escape them.
Right.
So basically, all that time I was writing while I was teaching, and that part of my life became much more dynamic and much more interesting to me.
How'd you land at the Times?
I wrote in the early 80s a large profile of the American Nazi movement in the Midwest. And one of the fellows I focused on became the Republican candidate for Congress in South Side of Chicago in this last time around.
Mm-hmm. Is that right?
Arthur Jones.
Oh, my goodness.
And so I spent a lot of time writing about them and doing their lives and trying to figure out what made them tick. And that story, it was a huge story, and it was in the cover of the newspaper and ran for probably 12, 15,000 words, and did a lot of work into their minds and past. And that story made me known to daily journalism.
Right.
One of the Chicago Sun-Times newspaper asked me to come over and apply for a job, and soon after I heard from the New York Times.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's fortunate for your readers,
Mm-hmm.
for us, that you made that decision, because as I said, you did have options, so we're glad that you went into journalism and not into teaching. One more time, congratulations, Brent Staples. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Bob.
Right. We'll be back in a moment with a final word. When there are enemies of democracy at the highest levels of elective office, they should be called out. So let's take a look at the U.S. Senate Republican leader, Mitch McConnell. McConnell poked his middle finger squarely into the eye of democracy in 2016 when he refused to allow the Senate to confirm Barack Obama's appointment of Merrick Garland to fill a vacant seat on the Supreme Court. McConnell's reasoning was as specious as he is hypocritical. He said a president shouldn't be allowed to appoint a Supreme Court justice during a presidential election year. Well, next year is once again a presidential election year. McConnell was asked if he would allow President Trump to fill a vacancy on the court should one of the current justices retire or die. McConnell smiled, or maybe it was a smirk. "Oh, we'd fill it," he said. In other words, democracy be damned. Let's move to another important cornerstone of democracy, the right to vote. There are more Democrats in the U.S. than Republicans, so the Republican Party has long tried its best to keep as few Democrats as possible from being able to cast a ballot. They've pushed voter ID laws and gone out of their way to block such advances as automatic voter registration, early voting, same-day voting, and so forth. Most of the time, the GOP claims its positions are necessary to prevent voter fraud. You'll almost never hear a Republican admit the truth, that their goal is to offset their numerical disadvantage by suppressing the turnout of Democrats as much as possible. Mitch McConnell is the exception. He doesn't care who sees or hears him squeezing the breath out of our democratic processes. Consider this. There is a movement underway to make Election Day a federal holiday. That way, more people would be able to vote. McConnell opposes it. Why? He made it clear. He sees the proposal as, quote, a power grab by Democrats. In other words, the more people who vote, the worse things are for McConnell's Republicans. So he wants fewer, not more people to vote. Mitch McConnell, an enemy of democracy who doesn't try to hide it. That's all for now. See you next time.